In this video, we will do the math portion of the ACT practice test. This is the Preparing for the ACT practice test published by ACT.org. I will provide a link to their website and a link to the test in the description of this video. Now, the 60 questions in this video are going to be identical to the 60 questions in the 2024-2025 video or practice test, also the 2023-2024 practice test, the 2022-2023 practice test, and the 2021-2022 practice test. All of those practice tests have the same 60 questions. I will provide a link to a playlist of other versions of the ACT practice tests, so for different years, in the description of this video as well. The math portion of this test starts on page 26. It says that you should be able to do all 60 questions in 60 minutes. This video will run longer than the 60 minutes because I'm going to cover in detail what I'm doing on each problem, and it's going to take longer for me to write down the steps and read the problem aloud. But this shows you how each and every one of these questions is done. So let's do the problems. Problem number 1 says the numbers 1 through 15 were each written on individual pieces of paper, one number per piece. Then the 15 pieces of paper were put in a jar. One piece of paper will be drawn from the jar at random. What is the probability of drawing a piece of paper with a number less than 9 on it? So we're saying, what is the probability that the number I draw is going to be less than 9? Well, this is classical probability. The denominator is going to be all of the options. So since each number from 1 through 15 could be drawn, there are 15 different options. And the numbers that are less than 9 are 1 through 8. So there are 8 numbers less than 9. Therefore, the answer to question number 1 is 8/15. And that is option E. Question 2. Which of the following expressions is equivalent to negative 4x to the third minus 12x to the third plus 9x squared? In this problem, we're going to combine like terms. When we combine negative 4x to the third and negative 12x to the third, we get negative 16x to the third. And then 9x squared is not a like term to the other two. So that gives us negative 16x to the third plus 9x squared, which is option J. Question 3. When x is equal to 2, 10 plus 3 times in parentheses 12 divided by 3x is equal to what? So this one is asking us to input 2 into the x value. So we get 10 plus 3 times 12 divided by 3 times 2. When that's all said and done, we'll do it that way. Start on the inside of the parentheses. 3 times 2 is 6. That's the first thing I would do. That's the innermost parentheses. So I get 6 there. Let me just rewrite that as 6. 12 divided by 6 is 2. So I'm going to get 10 plus 3 times 2. And that is obviously 16. 3 times 2 is 6, plus 10 is 16. So B is the answer to question 3. Question 4. Absolute value of 6 minus 4 minus the absolute value of 3 minus 8. So when I take 6 minus 4, I get a 2. That's going to be the absolute value of 2 minus the absolute value of 3 minus 8. 3 minus 8 is negative 5. So we get absolute value of 2 minus absolute value of negative 5. Now, when I apply the absolute values, that gives me 2 minus 5. So we get a negative 3 as the answer. So negative 3 is the answer to question number 4, and that is option G. Question 5, the expression 4c minus 3d all times 3c plus d is equivalent to what? This one is asking us to multiply things out. So we're going to distribute 4c is going to multiply by both terms in the right-hand side polynomial. Then negative 3d will multiply times both terms in the right-hand side polynomial. 4c times 3c is 12c squared. 4c times d is 4cd. Then negative 3d times 3c is minus 9. You can either write that as dc or cd. And then minus 3d times d is minus 3 times d squared. Those middle terms are alike, so I can combine those to give me 12c squared minus 5cd minus 3d squared. And that obviously is option C. So option C is the answer to question 5. Question 6. Of the 180 students in a college course, a quarter of the students earned an A, a third of the students earned a B, and the rest of the students earned a C for the course. How many students earned a C? So what I would start by doing is say that since a quarter of the students of the 180 students earned an A, the number of students earning an A was 45. The number of students who earned a B was a third of 180, and that would be 60. Now, how many students earned a C? Since A plus B plus C has to be the total number of students, and now we know the number who earned an A was 45, the number who earned a B was 60. We can solve. Now you can either add the 45 and 60 up to get 105 and then subtract, or you could just subtract 45 from both sides and then subtract 60 from both sides. In either case, the number of students who earned a C was 75. So the number who earned a C was 75, and that is option F. Question 7. The number of fish F in Skipper's Pond at the beginning of each year can be modeled by the equation f of x is equal to 3 times the quantity 2 raised to the x power, where x represents the number of years after the beginning of the year 2000. For example, x equals 0 is 2000, x equals 1 is the beginning of 2001, and so on and so forth. According to the model, how many fish were in Skipper's Pond at the beginning of 2006? So at the beginning of 2006, that's an x value of 6. And to figure out how many fish were in the pond there, we do f of 6, which is 3 times 2 raised to the 6th power. When you plug that into a calculator, you'll get 192. So the answer to question 7 is B, 192. Question 8. Manish drove from Chicago to Baton Rouge. At 8 a.m., he was 510 kilometers from Baton Rouge. At 1 p.m., he was 105 kilometers from Baton Rouge. Which of the following values is closest to Manisha's average speed in kilometers per hour from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m.? So average speed, we're going to take the number of kilometers total that he drove in that time. So total number of kilometers that he drove, and divide it by the number of hours that he drove. So the number of kilometers that he drove, since he was 510 kilometers away at 8 o'clock, and then only 105 kilometers away at 1 o'clock, the number of kilometers he drove is the difference between 510 and 105. And then for the hours, he drove from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. I just count 8 to 9 is 1, to 10 is 2, to 11 is 3, to noon is 4, to 1 p.m. is 5 hours. So what you would get is the fraction 405 divided by 5, which is 81 kilometers per hour. So 81 kilometers per hour is the best estimate for the average kilometers per hour that he drove. And that is option H. So H is the correct answer to question 8. Question 9. In the figure below, E and G lie on AC, D and F lie on AB. DE, FG are both parallel to BC, and the given lengths are in feet. What is the length of A to C in feet? So I want to figure out a certain length in feet. I want to find the length of A all the way down to C. Now, the key thing here is noticing that ABC is a similar triangle to ADE, where AD corresponds to AB and AC corresponds to AE. So what we can do is we can create a proportion where the length of AD compared to the length of AE is the same as the length of AB compared to the length of AC. Now we have the numbers for 3 of those. We know AD is 8. We know AE is 16. So we have 8 over 16 on the left-hand side. We know that going from A to B, that's a total of 8 plus 7 plus 6. That adds up to 21. So proportionally, 8 over 16 should be equal to 21 over AC. So the length of AC, you can either solve by doing cross multiplication. 8 times the length of AC is equal to 16 times 21, and then divide by 8. Or if you wanted to, you could just notice that 8 over 16, the denominator is double the numerator. And therefore, AC has to be double the numerator, which double 21 is 42. So whichever way you choose to solve that is perfectly fine. But we get that the length from A to C is 42. So D is the correct answer to question 9. Question 10. Katerina runs 15 miles in 2.5 hours. What is the average number of minutes it takes her to run 1 mile? So first off, we have to realize that 2.5 hours, I can multiply that times 60 because there are 60 minutes per 1 hour. So when I multiply that, I end up seeing that 2.5 hours is 150 minutes, okay? And if we want to figure the average number of minutes it takes to run 1 mile, then all we have to do is set the number of minutes she ran divide by the number of miles that she ran. So 150 minutes for every 15 miles. Then we simplify 150 over 15. That gives me 10. So that's 10 minutes per mile. And that's it. That's my answer. 10 minutes per mile. So G is the correct answer to question 10. Question 11. A bag contains 8 red marbles, 9 yellow marbles, and 7 green marbles. How many additional red marbles must be added to the 24 marbles already in the bag so that the probability of randomly drawing a red marble is 3 out of 5? So we're going to add red marbles. Now, the probability of drawing a red marble right now is 8 out of 24 because there's 8 red out of 24 total. If we're going to add red marbles to the bag, we're going to add some number R, both to the amount of red marbles plus the total amount in the bag. And we want that fraction to be equivalent to 3 over 5. And so I can solve this equation. I would cross multiply 5 times 8 plus R gives me 40 plus 5R. 24 plus R times 3 gives me 72 plus 3R. And then what we would do is we would subtract 40 from both sides. We'd get 5R is equal to 32 plus 3R. And then subtract 3R from both sides, giving me 2R is equal to 32. And then when I divide both sides by 2, I get R equals 16. So this means that I need to add 16 red marbles if I want to make the probability of drawing a red marble 3/5. So the answer to question 11 is B, 16. Question 12. In the standard XY coordinate plane, the point 2,1 is the midpoint of CD. Point C has coordinates 6, 8. What are the coordinates of D? Well, let's imagine first that D is a given point. We'll just call it X comma Y because that's our usual notation. A midpoint is halfway between. So basically, we want halfway between C and D to be the point 2, 1. Now, whenever we get halfway in between, that's just averaging. So if you look at the X values, this means that my X value of point C, which is 6, plus the X value of point D, which is X, averaged out, so divide by 2, have to give me the X value of the midpoint. So that would be 6 plus X divided by 2 is equal to 2. I can do the same thing for the Y values. For the Y values, the Y value of C, which is 8, plus the Y value of D, which we called just Y, over 2, that's the average of the Y values of C and D, should be equal to the average, should be equal to 1, that is the Y value of the midpoint. So we get these two equations that we can solve. We can solve this one for X, we can solve this one for Y, and then we're good to go. So on the left-hand version, we get 6 plus X equals 4. That's after I multiply both sides by 2. If I subtract 6 from both sides, X is going to be -2. In a similar way, I'd get 8 plus Y equals 2 when I multiplied both sides by 2. Subtracting 8 from both sides gives me a Y value of -6. Therefore, the point D has to have X coordinate of -2 and Y coordinate of -6. So D is -2, -6, which is option G. So the answer to 12 is G. Question 13. At his job, the first 40 hours each week that Thomas works is regular time, and any additional time that he works is overtime. Thomas gets paid $15 per hour during regular time, and during overtime, he gets paid 1.5 times as much. Thomas works 46 hours in 1 week and gets $117 in deductions taken out of his pay for that week. After the deductions are taken out, how much of Thomas's pay for the week remains? So the first thing I want to just focus on is the overtime pay. That is going to be 1.5 times $15, and so that's going to be $22.50. Now I can calculate how much Thomas takes home. The amount that he takes home is, since he works 40 hours at regular pay, and he's going to work an additional 6 hours at overtime pay, he takes home 40 times 15 plus 6 times 22.50. But then, I should say, he gets paid that, but then he gets $117 taken out. So the amount that he takes home is going to be just that calculation. And if you do that calculation, 40 times 15 plus 6 times 22.5 minus 117, that is $618. So he's going to take home $618, and therefore the answer is D. Question 14. At Sweet Stuff Fresh Produce, the price of a bag of grapes depends on the total number of bags purchased at one time, as shown in the table below. In 2 trips to Sweet Stuff this week, Janelle purchased 3 bags of grapes on Monday and 4 bags of grapes on Wednesday. How much money would Janelle have saved if she had instead purchased 7 bags of grapes in 1 trip on Monday? So let's take the 2-trip amount first and calculate how much she spent on 2 trips. So Janelle would have spent, well, since she bought 3 bags on Monday, 3 bags puts us in the first category, which is price per bag of $3. So 3 bags at $3 per bag in the first trip. And then in the second trip, she would have spent $2.80 per bag because she bought 4 bags. So 4 bags at $2.80. So that's how much Janelle spent on the 2 trips. Once you calculate that, that's $20.20. If she would have went in 1 trip, the amount that she would have spent is, well, she would have bought 7 bags, and the price per bag if she buys 7 is $2.60. So she would have bought 7 at $2.60. Once you calculate that, that's $18.20. So if we're asking how much she would have saved if she went in 1 trip, the amount that she would have saved is the difference, 2020 minus 1820, which is, minus 1820, which is obviously $2. So she would have saved exactly $2 if she would have bought everything in 1 trip. And therefore the answer is J. Question 15. What is 3% of 4.13 times 10 to the 4th power? 3% of something is 0.03 times that number. So I'm just going to take 0.03 times 4.14 times 10 raised to the fourth power. I'd probably plug that into my calculator. Obviously, it'd be real tough not doing that. And when you do that, you get 1,242. So 1,242, or option A, is the answer to question 15. Question 16. What value of x satisfies this equation? You could, if you want, try to plug in all these values, but that actually takes longer than just solving the equation. So I'm going to solve the equation. The first thing I would do is distribute the -3 into the parentheses. That would give me -12x plus 15 on the left-hand side. And then I distribute the 2 into the right-hand side parentheses, which would be 2 minus 10x on the right-hand side. Now, I would probably subtract 15 from both sides. If I did that, I'd get -12x is equal to -13 minus 10x. And then I'd add 10x to both sides, giving me -2x is equal to -13. Once I did that, divide both sides by -2. -13 over a -2 is the same thing as a +13 over a +2. So 13 over 2 is the answer to question 16. And so that's option K. Question 17. In right triangle ABC shown, the given lengths are in millimeters. What is the sign of A? Now, in order to get the sign, it's nice to remember the mnemonic SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA stands for the sign of an angle in a right triangle is equal to the length of the side opposite the angle divided by the length of the hypotenuse. The other parts of SOHCAHTOA say cosine is the length of the side adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, and tangent is the length of the side opposite divided by the length of the side adjacent the angle. So if we're looking at A is up here. The side opposite A has length 7. The hypotenuse of this right triangle, that's the side opposite the 90-degree angle, has length 9. So we get 7/9 as the answer. By the way, be careful, that only works on right triangles. SOHCAHTOA does. So 7/9 is the right answer, and D is the answer to question 17. Question 18. We have the fraction 27 over 64 raised to the -2/3 power. So you can do this by hand. You can just plug it into your calculator if you want as well and get a fraction. That's perfectly fine. I will do this in a couple of steps. If you didn't have a calculator, this would be how you would do it. You would say, well, first off, a negative exponent means reciprocal of the fraction raised to the positive exponent. So 27 over 64 raised to the -2/3 is like 64 over 27 raised to the +2/3. Now, I'm going to take the 1/3 power part on each of my numerator and denominator. So I'm going to think of taking 64 to the 1/3 power, and then I'm going to take 27 to the 1/3 power. Again, this is what I would do if I didn't have a calculator. I'd probably just plug it in if I did have access to a calculator. Now I ask what times what times what gives me 64? Well, 4 times 4 times 4 gives me 64. And then what times what times what gives me 27? 3 times 3 times 3 would give me a 27. So we get 4/3 squared, which you can apply the 2 to both the numerator and denominator, giving you 16/9. So 16/9 is the answer to question 18, and that is option J. Question 19. Lodo begins at his back door and walks 8 yards east, 6 yards north, 12 yards east, and 5 yards north to his barn door. About how many yards less would he walk if he could walk directly from the back door to the barn door? Now, this is one where I would draw a picture. So I'm going to do that. I've already done that. And now I'm just going to paste it in. So 8 yards east, then 6 yards north, then 12 yards east, then 5 yards north. That's how he's walking in the stair-stepper manner. And I'm trying to find the value of X and then figure out how many yards less that would be than walking all of these. Now, I want to point out that the amount that he is walking right now is just 8 plus 6 plus 12 plus 5, and that means that he's walking 31 yards. So he walks 31 yards now. Now I want to find what he would do if he did a straight line. So what would the X be? Well, X is the hypotenuse of a right triangle whose base is 20. Notice that's 8 plus 12. And whose height, so the other leg, is 11. That's 5 plus 6. So I can find X by using the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, where a and b are the legs of a right triangle, c is the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So like I said, one leg is size 20. The other leg is size 11. And so we get 20 squared plus 11 squared is equal to x squared. So again, remember this x, let's say x squared, that is going to be the square root of 521. Well, x squared is going to be 521 when I do the calculations. So x is going to be the square root of 521, which is an irrational number, which is approximately 22.83 yards. So the amount that Lodo would save would be about 31 minus 22.83, which is just a little bit over 8. It's about 8.17. So he would have saved about 8.17 yards walking straight than walking in this stair-stepper fashion. And therefore, the answer to question 19 is A, 8. Question 20. For a given set of data, the standard score Z corresponding to the raw score X is given by Z equals X minus mu over sigma, where mu is the mean and the set of the set and sigma is the standard deviation. If for a set, the scores mu equals 78, sigma equals 6, which of the following is the raw score X corresponding to a Z value of 2? So this is a Z score or Z value. We're saying essentially if the Z is 2, we got X minus mu over sigma. We know mu is 78. We know sigma is 6. So it's just requiring me to solve this. Multiply both sides by 6, giving me 12 is equal to x minus 78. Then adding 78 to both sides gives me that the x value has to be 90. And therefore, the answer to question 20 is F. Question 21. In the figure below, A, B, C, and D lie on the circle centered at O. Which of the following does not appear in the triangle, or in the figure? Which type of triangle doesn't appear in the figure? So the key thing there is notice that since O is the center, the measure from O to A and O to B and O to C and O to D are all going to be equal because that is always the radius of the circle. So if we look at here, part A says, is an acute triangle? Well, there is an acute triangle. Acute means all of the angles are less than 90. You can see that OAB is acute. All of the angles are going to be less than 90. So it's actually going to be 60, 60, 60, which is an equilateral triangle, which also shows you that B is not the correct answer either. All right, so since it's a 60, 60, 60 triangle, we have an equilateral. Isosceles triangle means two sides are the same. And we see that with ODC. We have O to D, O to C are both same, so that's isosceles. ODC is also a right triangle because it has this 90-degree angle. The only option that we don't have is E, scalene. Scalene triangles mean that no sides are the same. And none of the triangles we see here have every side being different. So scalene means every side is different or no sides are the same. And so E is the correct answer to 21. Question 22. What is the slope of a line in the standard XY coordinate plane that is parallel to x plus 5y equals 9? What I would do is I would put that x plus 5y equal to 9 in slope-intercept form. The first thing I would do is subtract x from both sides, giving me 5y is equal to negative x plus 9. Then I divide both sides by 5, giving me y equals negative 1/5 x plus 9/5. Now the slope of that line is the coefficient of x, which is negative 1/5. We know that parallel lines have the same slope. So we want our slope to also be negative 1/5. And so G, negative 1/5, is the answer to question 22. Question 23. Given that y is equal to x over x minus 1 and x is greater than 1, which of the following is a possible value of y? So it gives us some possible values for y. Obviously, we don't want to plug in all kinds of numbers in for x, so we just use logic here. Now, since y is greater than 1, that means, or excuse me, not y, since y is equal to x over x minus 1 and x is greater than 1, if I look at this fraction, the numerator of the fraction is going to be positive and the denominator is also going to be positive because I'm going to get x greater than 1, that's a positive number on top. Since x is greater than 1, x minus 1 is going to be a positive on bottom. So I know that my y value has to be positive. Also, notice that x is bigger than x minus 1. So that means when I look at my fraction y, the numerator is always going to be bigger than the denominator. And so that means y is always going to be bigger than 1. So numerator is always going to be bigger than the denominator. That means the y is always going to be bigger than 1. And so the only option that we have, which is positive and bigger than 1, is E, 1.9. So the answer to question 23 is E, 1.9. Question 24. The set of all positive integers that are divisible by 15 and 35 is infinite. What is the least positive integer in this set? So this is asking us for essentially the least common multiple. And that's going to require me to break up 15. Think of that as 3 times 5. I'll also break up 35 as 5 times 7. And if I'm looking for the least common multiple, then I just pick out all of the prime factors and how often they occurred. So I get 3 once, 5 occurred in each breakdown. I only need to put it in once because it occurred once in each breakdown. And then put in 7. So my least common multiple is going to be the product of 3, 5, and 7, which is 105. And that is the least positive integer that is divisible by both 15 and 35. So you can divide 105 by 15, you can divide 105 by 35, and that's the smallest integer with both of those properties. Question 25. In triangle ABC shown, the measure of angle A is 58, and the length of AB is equivalent to the length of AC. If the length of AB is equal to the length of AC, then we know that we have an isosceles triangle. And we also know that the angle opposite those sides are going to be equal. So the angle at B is going to be equal to the angle at C. So angle B and angle C are going to be the same. Okay. Now we also know that in a triangle, the angles have to add up to 180 degrees as in degree mark. Since A is size 58 and B and C are the same, I can say that 58 plus C has to be equal to 180. So that means 2C is equal to, well, what I get by subtracting 180 minus 58, which is 122, then divide both sides by 2. So the angle at C is equal to 61. And so option D is the correct answer for question 25. Question 26. About 1.48 times 10 to the 8th square kilometers of the Earth's surface is land. The rest, 3.63 times 10 to the 8th square kilometers, is water. If a returning space capsule lands at a random point on the Earth's surface, which of the following is the best estimate of the probability that a space capsule lands in water? So basically, we need to find the probability of landing in water. And what we would do is we would do the total land area of water divided by the total overall area. So in this case, the amount of water is 3.63 times 10 to the 8th. And then the total is going to be the sum. Now, when you add 1.48 times 10 to the 8th plus 3.63 times 10 to the 8th, we just have to add 1.48 times 3.63. The times 10 to the 8th is going to keep with us. That'll give me 5.11 times 10 to the 8th. So hopefully that everyone caught that. So add 1.48 plus 3.63. Since they're both times 10 to the 8th, we can just add those. And the times 10 to the 8th isn't going to matter that much. You can actually just put 3.63 over 5.11. And that gives me about 0.7104, which is about 71% or 71.04%. So option G is the correct answer for question 26. Question 27. On the first 7 stats tests of the semester, Jamal scored 61, 76, 79, 80, 80, 84, and 91. The mean, median, and mode of his scores were 79, 80, and 80, respectively. On the 8th test, Jamal scored 90. How did the mean, median, mode of all 8 of his scores compare to the mean, median, mode of his first 7? Well, the mean is going to be greater on the 8 because he scored higher than average. His average was obviously 79. So because he scored higher than the average, the mean will be greater. The median, well, here is where we'll throw this 90 in. So we throw the 90 into the set, and now we have a set of 8. So between the 4th and 5th highest scores, that's where our median's going to be. So it's going to be between 80 and 80. His old median was 80. Now his new median is 80. So the median is the same. And then as far as the mode goes, mode is most often scored. Since he scored a 90 on this last one, that will not affect the mode. Still, the most often number that occurred is 80. So the mode is going to be the same as well. So the mean is going to be greater. The median and the mode are both equal. And that means option E is the correct answer for question 27. Question 28. The solid rectangular prism shown below was built by alternating congruent black cubes and white cubes, such that 2 cubes of the same color have at most one edge touching. What is the total number of white cubes that were used to build the prism? Now, if you just count 1, 2, let's count on the first face, and then we'll use that logic to apply to all the other faces. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 white cubes on the first face. Since the first face is 7 cubes by 3 cubes, or not by 3, by 7 cubes by 6 cubes tall, we end up with 42 total cubes per face. All right. So 21 white cubes on the first face, 42 total cubes per face means that there's also 21 black cubes on that first face. Now, because of the way we alternate, notice that every time on the second face, all the black cubes will be replaced with white ones. All of the white cubes will be replaced with black ones. So technically, there's not just 21 white cubes on the first face, there's 21 white cubes on each face. And there's 21 black cubes on each face, or on each layer. Maybe layer is a better word, on each layer. And once you do that, now we just have to count the number of layers. So we have a first layer, a second layer, third layer, fourth layer, fifth layer. There's 5 total layers. So the total white cubes is going to be exactly 5 layers of 21 white cubes per layer. That's 105 white cubes total. And so option H is the correct answer to question 28. Question 29. One square of ABCD has length of one side of square ABCD has length of 12 meters. A certain rectangle whose area is equal to the area of ABCD has a width of 8 meters. What is the length in meters of that rectangle? So first off, the area of a square is just both sides, two sides multiplied times themselves. Since each side is length 12, it's going to be 12 times 12 or 12 squared. Which is 144 square meters. All right. The area of a rectangle is going to be the length of the rectangle times the width of the rectangle. Doesn't matter which way you write that, but area of a rectangle is length times width. It says that the area of the rectangle we're talking about is the same as the area of the square. So that's going to be 144 square meters. It also says that the width of the rectangle is 8. And then it's asking for the length of the rectangle. So if we divide both sides by 8, we get that the length of the rectangle is 18 meters. Everything's in meters or areas is square meters. So measurements, linear measurements are in meters, area measurements are in square meters. So 18 is the correct answer for question 29, and that's option C. Question 30. The average of a list of 4 numbers is 92.0. A new list of 4 numbers has the same first 3 numbers as the original list, but the 4th number in the original list is 40 and the 4th number in the new list is 48. What is the average of the new list of numbers? So let's start with the original. The original list average, we don't know what the first 3 numbers are, so we'll just call them A, B, and C. But we know the 4th one is 40. So when we divide that, we know we get a 92.0. The new list will have the first 3 numbers being the same, the A, B, and the C being the same, and the 4th number as 48. We're trying to find the average of that. Well, we can do that by breaking up that 48 into a 40 plus 8. So think of this as A plus B plus C plus 40 divided by 4. And then the 8 we're going to tack on, and we have to divide that by 4. So that's what we get. Notice that this number is what we have above, which is 92. And then 8 divided by 4 is 2. So we end up getting 92 plus 2, which is 94. So 94 is the correct answer to question 30, and that is option H. Question 31. The vector I represents 1 mile per hour east. The vector J represents 1 mile per hour north. Maria is jogging south at 12 miles per hour. One of the following vectors represents Maria's velocity in miles. Which one? Well, if north represents J, then south is going to be the opposite of J. So going south is going to be negative J, that would be 1 mile per hour south. If we're going 12 miles per hour south, then we're talking about negative 12 times j. So negative 12 times j is the vector that represents 12 miles per hour south. And that's option B. Question 32. 4 identical glasses are shown below. One glass is empty, and the other 3 glasses are a quarter full, a half full, and 4/5 full, respectively. If the water were redistributed equally among the 4 glasses, what fractional part of each glass would be filled? So redistribute equally means that we're going to take the average, and so each glass is going to get the average amount. So the first glass has 0. The second glass has a quarter. The third glass has a half. And the fourth glass has 4/5. So if we divide that out by 4, we'll figure out the average. That's how much would be an average of each glass. Now, when you do the addition on top, normally I would just do that with my calculator. That would give a total of 31 over 20. And then divide that by 4, and you get a fraction of 31/80 as the amount of water in each glass. So 31 over 80 is the average amount, and that means if I redistributed them into each glass, that each glass would have 31/80 amount of water. So K is the answer to question 32. Question 33. Aurelio is purchasing carpet tiles to cover an area of his living room that is 8 1/3 feet wide by 10 feet long. Each carpet tile is a square 20 inches wide by 20 inches long. What is the minimum number of carpet tiles that Aurelio must purchase to cover this area of his living room floor? So the first thing we're going to have to do is convert everything into feet or convert everything into inches. It turns out it's a little bit easier to convert into inches. So 8 1/3 feet, if you multiply that by 12, you get that 8 1/3 feet is 100 inches. Again, I just got that by multiplying by 12. 10 feet is equal to 120 inches. And again, I got that by multiplying by 12. So therefore, the area of the floor is going to be 100 inches times 120 inches, which is 1,000, excuse me, not 1,000, 12,000 square inches. So we have area of the floor is 12,000 square inches. The area of each tile, well, that is 20 inches by 20 inches. So take 20 inches, multiply that times 20 inches. Area of each tile is 400 square inches. Okay, so how many tiles would we need? Well, we just take that fraction of 12,000 divided by 400. That will give me the amount of tiles that are needed, and that is 30 tiles. So 30 is the correct answer to question 33, and that is option D. Question 34. In the standard XY coordinate plane, a circle with its center at 8, 5 and radius of 9 coordinate units has which of the following equations? So this requires me to understand what the general equation of a circle is, centered at a point and with radius a different value. So the general equation for a circle centered at HK with radius R is x minus h quantity squared plus y minus k quantity squared is equal to the radius squared. In our case, since we're centered at 8, 5, that's going to be x minus 8 quantity squared plus y minus 5 quantity squared is equal to 9 squared, since the radius is 9, 9 squared is 81. So that's the equation that we're looking for. And if you look in my options, that is option F. When doing questions 35 through 37, we're going to use the following table. So I'm going to read off what's happening on that table and then start doing 35, 36, 37, and 38. So the preface is many humans carry the gene YQ77. The YQ test determines with 100% accuracy whether a human carries YQ77. If a YQ test is positive, the human carries the gene. If the YQ test is negative, the human does not carry the gene. Sam designed a less expensive test for YQ77 called SAM77 test. It produces some incorrect results. To determine the accuracy of the SAM77 test, both tests were administered to 1,000 volunteers. The results from this administration are summarized in the table below. So if you see the table, 590 people got a positive YQ test and a positive SAM77 test. 25 people got a positive YQ test and a negative SAM77 test. And the same way for negatives YQ test as well. Question 35 says, it costs $2,500 to administer each YQ test and $50 to administer each SAM77 test. What is the total cost to administer both tests to all the volunteers? Since there were 1,000 volunteers and each one got the YQ test and each one got the SAM test, we'd take 1,000 times 2,500 plus 50. I'm just going to write that as this. So $2,550 per volunteer times 1,000 volunteers gives me $2,550,000. That's how much the total cost to administer both tests to each volunteer. Question 36. What percent of the volunteers actually carry YQ77? Now, I copied and pasted the table here so that I didn't have to go back up. Well, remember, actually carrying the YQ77 means that you tested positive with the YQ test. So everybody who tests positive with YQ carries that gene. And therefore, if I'm looking for the probability of YQ77, what I can do is take all of the positive YQ tests. By the way, that's 590 plus 25, so that's 615, out of the total group. Since there were 1,000 people, that's 615 out of 1,000, which is 0.615 or 61.5%. Therefore, J is the correct answer to question 36. Question 37. For how many volunteers did the SAM77 test give an incorrect result? So there's two ways we could have gotten an incorrect result using the SAM77. If they actually had YQ, but SAM77 said they did not, that's these 25 people here. The other way we could have gotten an incorrect result is if the YQ set test said negative, but the SAM77 test said positive. So those are those 10 people. So the 10 people here plus the 25 people there are both an incorrect result. So that means 35 people in this study had an incorrect result. So the answer to question 37 is C, 35. Question 38. One of the volunteers whose SAM77 test result was positive will be chosen at random. So we're going to choose a positive SAM77. To the nearest 1,000th, what is the probability that the chosen volunteer does not possess YQ77? So what's the probability that we don't have YQ77 given that we're choosing out of the positive SAM group? So we're choosing out of the positive SAM77 test. That's the 590 and this 10. So that's the 600 people who tested positive with SAM77. Of those 600, 10 of them had a negative YQ test. So that means 10 of them actually don't possess the gene, where 590 of them do. So 10 out of 600 is our probability of not having YQ, but having a positive test. And if you do that simplification and round to 3 decimal places, you get 0.017. It's 0.016 repeating, and that 6 repeating gives me a rounded version to 7. So the answer to question 38 is F, 0.017. Question 39. Given matrices X and Y, which of the following matrices is X times Y? So this requires me to understand how to multiply a matrix which has 1 row and 2 columns by another matrix which has 1 column and 2 rows, or 2 rows and 1 column. So what you do in this situation is that's going to produce another matrix, but what you would do is you take the -1 and multiply it times this -2. So it's kind of like taking the first one, this row, turning it upright and multiplying it through times this column. So -1 times -2 becomes a +2. Actually, let me just write down what I'm doing. And then plus, then I take the 0 times the -1. When you do that operation, you get 2 plus 0, or 2. So that's your final answer, that X times Y is equal to 2, which is option D. So the answer to 39 is option D, which is 2. Question 40. Regardless of how the graph is oriented in the standard XY coordinate plane, no graph in one of the following categories has a vertical line of symmetry. Well, if you look at this, a line has symmetry if you put it in the right direction. A square has symmetry if you put it in a right direction. A regular pentagon would have symmetry if you put it in a right direction. And a parallelogram will have symmetry if you orient it in the right direction. Scalene triangles have 3 sides which are all different lengths, and therefore scalene triangle is the only figure that can't have a line of symmetry if you orient it in any direction, because all 3 lengths of sides are different. So the answer to 40 is K, scalene triangle. Question 41, the equation 24x squared plus 2x equals 15 has two solutions. What is the greater of the two solutions? Now, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. I'm going to do this in the, I don't know, maybe it's harder, maybe it's easier, I don't know. I'm going to try to do it in the easier way. So what I would do is take 24x squared plus 2x, and then I'd subtract 15 from both sides, giving me minus 15 on the left and equal to 0 on the right. Now I've set up a quadratic equation. If I can factor this easily, I'd factor this, but I can't factor this very easily. So I'm going to turn right to the quadratic formula, which says take the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. b, c, and a are the coefficients of these terms. B is the coefficient of the x term, A is the coefficient of the x squared term, C is the constant term. And so if we're doing that in this case, what we would get is opposite of 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 24 times a negative 15. All divided by 2 times 24. And then we go ahead and simplify that. That's going to give me negative 2, either plus or minus the square root. When I simplify what's inside that square root, it's 1,444 divided by 48. Now, we turned out, in this case, to be lucky because the square root of 1,444 is just 38. So what we get is negative 2 plus or minus 38 over 48. Now, this gives me two answers for x, one with the plus, one with the minus. If I'm looking for the greater of the two answers, it's going to be the x value where I've added 38. So just take negative 2 plus 38 and divide it by 48. So when you do that, you get 36 divided by 48, which if you simplify that, gives you 3/4. So both are divisible by 12. So divide the top and bottom by 12, giving you 3/4. So 3/4 is the greater of the two solutions. And therefore, A is the correct answer to question 41. Question 42. Which of the following expressions is equal to sine of 60 degrees times cosine of 30 degrees plus cosine of 60 degrees times sine of 30 degrees? Now, how I would do this if I were pressed for time on the test is I would just type this whole thing into my calculator, making sure to know that the mode of my calculator is in degree mode. As long as the mode of your calculator is in degree mode, what you get is that expression to be 1. Now, the reason it's 1 is because of understanding how, excuse me, the unit circle works. Sine of 60 degrees is actually the square root of 3 divided by 2. Cosine of 30 degrees is also the square root of 3 divided by 2. Whoops. Let me. That's better. And then it turns out sine of 60 and cosine of 60 and sine of 30 are both 1/2. So that's 1/2 multiplied times another 1/2. And so that gives you 3/4 plus 1/4, which is 1. So that's how we get 1. Again, you don't really need to know any of this. All you need to do is plug this whole thing into your calculator, get 1. And then we just have to decide what value is 1. You can use your calculator to do this as well, as long as you're in degree mode. This is cosine of 30 degrees. That is not 1. That's √3/2. Cosine of 90 degrees. Cosine of 90 degrees is 0. That's not 1. This is sine of 30 degrees. Sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. That's not 1. Then J gives me sine of 90 degrees, which is 1. So sine of 90 degrees is also 1, and therefore J is the correct answer. K would be sine of 45, which is obviously not 1 either. But sine of 90 degrees is 1 as well. So the answer to question 42 is J. Question 43. What is the area in square units of a circle that has circumference 12 pi units long? So the circumference of a circle is, you can think of it as diameter times pi, or most people think of it as 2 times the radius times pi. If I know that I'm working with a circle which has circumference of 12 pi, then that means the radius has to be 6. Divide by 2, divide by pi, you get radius of 6. Now the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. And if our radius is 6, then the area of that circle is going to be pi times 6 squared, which is 36 times pi. So 36 times pi is the area in square units of a circle that has circumference 12 pi. So D is the correct answer to question 43. Question 44. A barrel contains 25 liters of solvent mixture that is 40% solvent and 60% water. Lee will add pure solvent to the barrel without removing any of the mixture currently in the barrel. So the new mixture will be 50% solvent and 50% water. How many liters of pure solvent should Lee add to create this new mixture? Now, let's talk about the original mixture. In the original, of that 25 liters, 40% of that 25 is going to be solvent. 40% of 25 is 25 liters of pure solvent. And 60% of that 25 is going to tell me that we have 15 liters of water. Now, if I want a 50-50 mixture, and I'm not adding any water, I'm just adding solvent, then I need to make sure that the amount of solvent is equal to the amount of water. So basically, all we have to do is add 5 liters of pure solvent, and then we end up with 15 liters of solvent and 15 liters of water. So if we want a 50-50 mix and I can't add water, then I want 15 liters of solvent and 15 liters of water. So add 5 liters of solvent and we'll be done. Therefore, the answer to question 44 is G of 5. Question 45. For all x not equal to positive or negative y, x plus x divided by x plus y over x minus y is equal to what? Now, this is just asking us to rewrite our expression. Now, if I'm going to rewrite that expression, what I want to do is to get common denominators. And in order to get common denominators, I'm going to have to multiply each fraction by a fraction which is equivalent to 1. So in these cases, notice that x plus y is one denominator, x minus y is the other. So in the first fraction, I need to multiply by x minus y on top and bottom. On the second fraction, what I would want to do is multiply times x plus y on top and bottom. Well, when I do that, in the first fraction, I'll get x times x, that's x squared, minus x times y. And in the bottom, this is a difference, x plus y times x minus y. I guess I'll do the multiplication first. You get x squared minus xy plus xy minus y squared. Notice that the positive xy and the minus xy cancel each other out. So the middle terms cancel each other out. And I get a difference of squares, which is what I was going to say. And in the second fraction, y times x, same thing as x times y, plus y squared. And in the denominator, once again, you're just going to get x squared minus y squared. So when you combine those two fractions, since they have the same denominator, we can just add the numerators up. Notice that the minus xy and the plus xy will cancel each other out. So we'll just be left with x squared plus y squared divided by quantity x squared minus y squared. And that is option E. So option E is the correct answer for question 45. Question 46. Mary, James, and Carlos sold quarter-page advertisements for the school yearbooks. Mary sold twice as many as Carlos. James sold 3 times as many as Mary. What fraction of the ads did Carlos sell? So if Mary sold twice as many as Carlos, the amount that Mary sold, M, is going to be twice the amount Carlos sold, C. James sold 3 times as many as Mary, which is 3 times 2C. So James also sold 6 times the amount of Carlos. And then obviously Carlos sold C, right? And so the fraction that Carlos sold we could get by taking Carlos's amount over the total amount. Carlos's amount is C. The total amount is going to be 2C plus 6C plus 1C. So we're going to get 9C as the total amount that were sold by the 3 people. C divided by 9C, the C's will cancel out, and you'll get 1/9. So Carlos sold 1/9 of the ads. And therefore, F is the correct answer to question 46. Question 47. In a window display at a flower shop, there are 3 spots for 1 plant each. To fill these 3 spots, Emily has 6 plants to select from, each of a different type. Selecting from the 6 plants, Emily can make how many possible arrangements with 1 plant in each spot? Note that the positions of the unselected plants do not matter. So we have 3 spots and we have 6 plants. So for the first spot, I'm going to have 6 options. Once I pick that first spot, I have 5 plants left to choose from. So in my second spot, I'm going to have 5 options. And then in the last spot, I'm going to have 4 options. Now, the other plants that I haven't used, the order doesn't matter to those. So only those spots matter. So we get 6 times 5 times 4, which is 120 different arrangements where one plant is in each spot. So 120, option D, is the answer to question 47. Now, we're going to use this picture for questions 48 through 50. This picture shows a quadratic function f and a triangle MPQ graphed in a standard coordinate plane. We have points M at 2A, 5B, point N at 4A, 9B, point P at 6A, 5B, and point Q at 4A, 0. Q is not on the function, but M, P, N are on the function. So first question is 48. In terms of A and B, what is the area in square units of the triangle MPQ? So we have to do the area of a triangle. The area of a triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height. Well, the base is going to be the distance from M to P. If you notice that P is at 6A and M is at 2B, and we're on the same horizontal line, then the base is 4A. We went from 6A down to 2A. So we're going to have 1/2 times 4A. 4A is the base. Now let's figure out the height. Well, the height is the distance from MP down to Q, or from Q up to MP, on that same vertical line. Since we're on the same vertical line, we're going from a y value of 0 to a y value of 5b. And so 5b is the height. When you take 1/2 times 4 times 5, you get 10. So the total area of that triangle is 10 times AB. And therefore, the answer to question 48 is G. Question 49. Point M will remain fixed and point Q will move to the right along the x-axis. As Q continues to move to the right, which of the following statements describes what will happen to the slope of MQ? So basically, we're going to take this Q. Right now, MQ has this slope. As you move Q towards the right, let's say you move Q to here, well, the slope is going to increase because it's not going to be quite as steep in the negative direction. And as you move it like way out here, as you move the Q way out here, notice that the slope is going to increase and increase and increase, and the more you move it to the right, the more it increases. However, the slope will always be negative. So slope will increase, but always be negative. No matter how far you move it to the right, since it's on the x-axis, it'll still be negative. So let's look at the options for that. Well, I said always be negative. D says increase, but will never be positive. So D is the correct answer. It will increase, but it will never be positive. Question 50. One of the following values is equal to f of 5b. Which one? So we're looking at f. F is this quadratic. We're just basically asking what, when you plug in 5a, do you get as the output? Well, 5a is right here, If I plug that in, it looks like I would be on the function at this point up here. Looks like we're at the point 5a, comma 8b. So when I plug in 5a, I'm going to get out an 8b, and that's my final answer. So the answer to question 50 is K, 8b. Question 51. 12 jurors are needed for an upcoming trial. The diagram below illustrates a part of the jury process selection. The 12 jurors will be selected from a jury pool of about 60 people. The court records show that a trend that only 40% of the people who are summoned for jury duty actually appear, and that of the people who appear, a third are excused. By the way, if 30 people, a third are excused, that means 2/3 fall into the jury pool. And if 40% appear, that means 60% did not appear. If this same trend continues, how many people should be summoned to have as close as possible to 60 people in the jury pool? Now, if you think about this, we have this tree diagram. Going from summoned to appear is about 40%. Going from summoned to does not appear would be about 60%. From appear to excused, a third of the people go into the excused pile. 2/3 of the people go into the jury pool pile. If I wrote that down, I'd get this shape right here. So summoned, 40% appear, 60 don't. Third are excused, 2/3 go into the pool. Now we want our jury pool to be of size 60. If I let n be equal to the number of people summoned, then what we're saying is that if I take the number of people who are summoned, I have to multiply that times 40%, that's 0.40. That's how many people appear. And then I need to multiply that number by 2/3. That's the number of people in my jury pool. So in my jury pool. But we want 60 people to be in our jury pool. So how many people would I need to summon to get 60 people in my jury pool? That's just solving this equation. So what I would do is I would divide both sides by 0.40 and then divide both sides by 2/3, which is the same thing as multiplying by 3/2. When I do both of those operations, what you end up with is 225. So in other words, I'm taking 60, dividing it by 0.40, and then I think of this as multiplying by 3/2. That would give me 225. So that's what's happening. So that's how I get my people summoned. So that means I need to summon about 225 people if I want 60 people to be in the jury pool. And therefore, the answer to question 51 is D, 225. Question 52. What is the 275th digit after the decimal point in the repeating decimal 0.6295, all repeating? Well, when we talk about 0.6295 repeating, we get 0.6295, and then there's another copy of 6295. And then there's another copy of 6295. So every 4 decimal places we're repeating, okay? Now think about taking 275 divided by 4. What you're going to get is 68 and 3/4. What that means is we're going to have 68 copies of 4. We're going to have 68 copies of 6295, the digits 6295. And then we're going to have 3 more digits, 6, to 9. So the 275th digit is going to be the 9. Because we have 68 copies, 68 rounds of 4, and then 3 extra. So 9 is the 275th digit, and that means the answer to question 52 is K. Question 53. Given that f of x is equal to x squared minus 4, and g of x is equal to x plus 3, what are all of the values of x for which f of g of x is 0? So f of g of x, we have to understand how function composition works. This means that I'm going to take my f and I'm going to plug in x plus 3 into my input for f. When I do that, I get x plus 3 quantity squared minus 4. In other words, I just replace the x with an x plus 3. Now, I want that thing to be 0. I want that output, x plus 3 squared minus 4, to be equal to 0. So then I solve this equation for x. We're going to take x plus 3 squared, add 4 to both sides. You get x plus 3 squared is equal to 4. Now I can take both the positive and negative square root of the negative and square root of the right-hand side. So what I would end up with is that x plus 3 is equal to the positive and the negative of the square root of 4. Square root of 4 is just 2. And so this gives us two options. Either x plus 3 is equal to a positive 2, or x plus 3 is equal to a negative 2. Solving both of these, the first one gives you a negative 1. The second one gives you a negative 5. We're subtracting 3 from both sides. So negative 1 and negative 5 are the two values for which we get out 0 in the composition of f of g of x. So that's option A. So the answer to 53 is A. Question 54. Given that P is positive, N is negative, and absolute value of P is greater than the absolute value of N, which of the following expressions has the greatest value? So we're looking for a fraction in absolute value that has the greatest value. So we're going to be looking for the largest denominator, or not, sorry, largest numerator and the smallest denominator. So biggest thing on top. Notice that on top, we either have a P minus N or a P plus N. Since P is positive and N is negative, N minus P is going to be greater than P plus N, since N is negative. And these are both going to be positive numbers because the absolute value of P is greater than the absolute value of N. So P minus N is the larger of the numerators. P minus N is the larger of the numerators. The denominators, well, we have a P, an N, a P minus N. If I take P minus N, that's going to be positive and bigger than P because we're adding a little bit to the P. So that's bigger than P. And that p, it's positive, that's going to be bigger than the absolute value of n. So this means that the smallest denominator that I get, if I'm thinking about positive numbers, is the absolute value of n. So my greatest value here is going to be what happens when I end up with a numerator of p minus n and a denominator of n. So p minus n over n would give me my largest value of these options. And that is option G. So G is what I'm looking for. And that's the answer to question 54. Question 55. If I is the square root of -1, then that fraction is equal to what? Well, let's take that fraction I plus I squared plus I raised to the third power on top divided by I raised to the third power plus I raised to the fourth power plus I raised to the fifth power on bottom. So we're not going to simplify, but since I is a square root of -1, I squared is -1. So I squared becomes -1. I to the third, that's just like an I squared times another I. I squared is -1, so I get minus I as I to the third. In a similar way, I to the third on the bottom is minus I. I to the fourth is going to be I squared times I squared, which is a +1. And I to the fifth is going to be just I to the fourth times I. That's going to be a +I. Notice what happens. We're going to cancel out I and minus I on top. That gives me -1. Cancel out I and minus I on bottom. That gives me a +1. So the overall fraction is equal to -1. And so B is the correct answer to question 55. Question 56. In one of the following graphs, in the standard XY coordinate plane, the solution set to the system of inequalities below is shown shaded. Which one? I broke this up so I could write it on the right there. I'll come back to this. First off, if we look at x plus 2y less than or equal to 6, okay? It's going to go through the point 6, 0. When I plug in 6 for x and 0 for y, I get equality. And it's going to go through the point 0, 3. So we know it's going to be since it's less than or equal to, it's going to be a solid line going through 6, 0 and 0, 3. Of those options, that means we're going left to right. So I get option H, K, or F as my options. Now, also, if you think about this, we have less than or equal to 6. So we're actually going to be shading below. You can also test out by just plugging in the origin. The origin would give me a true statement, 0 less than or equal to 6. So we're going to shade below that line. So we're going to get a line and we're going to shade below it. And that means I only have options F and K to choose from. So if we look at the other inequality, 3x squared greater than 12 minus 3y squared. First off, I'd add 3y squared to both sides. And then I'd probably divide everything by a 3, giving me x squared plus y squared is greater than 4. That is a circle that is centered at the origin with radius 2. So for instance, it's going to go through the point 0, 2. Now I say that because to distinguish between F and K, we're going to distinguish between whether the circle goes above the point 0, 3 or whether it's below the point 0, 3. And obviously, because it has radius 2, it only can get up to 0, 2. We know the line goes through 0, 3, and therefore we know the circle is going to be below the line. So K is the correct option for question 56. So K is the correct option. The circle stays under the line. Question 57. Let A, B, C, and D be real numbers. Given that AC is equal to 1, B plus C over D is undefined, and ABC equals D, which of the following must be true? So if we have B plus C over D as being undefined, if B and C are real numbers, the only way this can be undefined forces D to be 0. The only way we get undefined is if the denominator there is 0. So D has to be 0, which means since ABC is equal to D, that means ACB is equal to 0. A times C we already established was equal to 1. So 1B is equal to 0, or in other words, B is equal to 0. So for 57, B is equal to 0 is forced by those two conditions. So option D is the correct answer. B is 0. Question 58. A cosine function is shown in the standard coordinate plane below. One of the following equations represents this function. Which one? Now, if you had a graphing calculator, you could graph some of these options and see which one works. If you didn't have a graphing calculator, then we could try to manipulate cosine by stretching and shrinking in both the vertical and the horizontal direction. So that's what we're going to do right now. Normally, y equals cosine of x, this would go up to +1 and down to -1. Since we're going up to 3 and down to -3, that means I need to multiply this by a 3. So I need to vertically stretch by a factor of 3. That's multiplying on the outside by 3. Now the period of cosine, that means how many revolutions it takes to get from this point back up to the same height. The period of cosine normally is 2 pi. Now, as we can see, the period is 1 pi. So we've cut the period down by a factor of 2. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Make sure that on the inside, cutting it down by a factor of 2 is actually multiplying x by a 2. So y equals 3 times cosine of 2x is the correct answer, and that's option K. Again, if you have a graphing calculator, you could graph this and confirm that this is the picture you get. So K is the answer to question 58. Question 59. The figure below shows a flying kite. At a certain moment, the kite string forms an angle of elevation at 75 degrees from point A on the ground. At the same moment, the angle of elevation at point B, 240 feet from A, is 45 degrees. What is the length in feet of the string? Now, this is not a right triangle, so I can't use any SOHCAHTOA or Pythagorean theorem. So it's just a different triangle. And by the way, the angle at the kite is going to be 180 minus 75 minus 45, which is 60. So 60 is the angle where the kite hits the string and the line from kite to B. So that's a 60-degree angle. All right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to apply law of sines. So law of sines. That's the easiest way to do this. This says sine of an angle. Usually we'll call this alpha, divided by the side opposite of the alpha is equal to sine of another angle, which we'll call beta, divided by the side opposite of beta. All right, so that's the law of sines. Now we're trying to find the length of the string. That's the ultimate goal here. Notice that the string length is the side opposite of B. I'll use beta B. So B, side opposite of B. I also know that from A to B is 240. That's the side opposite of the kite. So the sine of angle alpha, that's like the kite angle, is the side opposite of the kite, which would be 240. Now I know that the angle at the kite is 60 degrees. So sine of 60 divided by 240 is going to be equal to sine at B, which is sine of 45 degrees, divided by the side opposite of B, which is the string. I'm just going to call that T for string, I guess. Now I can solve. Cross multiply, divide, however you want to solve this. When I cross multiply, I'd get 240 multiplied times the sine of 45 equals sine of 60 times t. Then I divide both sides by sine of 60. And if you wanted to do this by hand, you could get an exact value. I would probably just punch that into my calculator, making sure that the mode is in degree mode, and I get 195.96 approximately. And obviously that's not option E, that is not option D, that's not option C. Just check B or A for which one that gets closer to. And it turns out that that's about 80 times the square root of 6. So 80 times the square root of 6 is the correct answer. Again, if you knew the sine of 45 is square root of 2 over 2, and the sine of 60 is square root of 3 over 2, and you could manipulate that to give you exactly 80 times root 6, but I don't need to. So 80 times root 6 is the answer, and that's option B. Question 60. if a publisher charges $15 for the first copy of a book that is ordered and $12 for each additional copy, which of the following expressions represents the cost of Y books? Now we need, when Y is equal to 1, we need the cost to be equal to 15. And then when Y is equal to 2, we need the cost to be 12 more than that. So we need the cost to be 27. Okay. And basically, that's giving me a cost equation where I take 12 times the number of books and then add 3. 12Y plus 3 is the cost of Y books. And so that's option F. And so the answer to question 60 is F, which is 12Y plus 3. So that is the end of the ACT practice test, preparing for the ACT practice test. Okay, this was the 2024-2025 version, which is the same as 2023-2024 questions, which is the same as the 2022-2023 and the same as 2021-2022. So all of those had the exact same questions. For other ACT practice tests, there will be a link to a playlist of those other ACT practice tests in the description of this video, at least the math portions of those. And lastly, if you are planning on taking the ACT soon, good luck with that. I hope this video helps you out.